The metaphor of blindness, the reality of blindness, of course, is one of the most pervasive themes and powerful metaphors in the Gospels. Repeatedly in the Gospels, Jesus is seen healing the blind. And yet, for me, the most compelling of all these miracles is the one that did not take the first time. Of course, we're talking about the blind man of Bethsaida. Do you remember the story? It goes like this. Putting spittle on his eyes, Jesus laid his hands on him and asked, "Do you see anything?" Looking up, the man replied, "I see people looking like trees and walking." Mark chapter 8, verse 23-24. I see people looking like trees and walking. Of course, Jesus finishes the healing and sends the man on his way. But it is the man's in-between shadowy state of partial sight and partial blindness that most intrigues me and seems an almost perfect metaphor for our human condition. Slow the story down and stretch it out over the course of a lifetime, generations, and then centuries, and the blind man of Bethsaida, before Jesus finishes the job, becomes a fitting parable for race relations in America. All of us are still on the way, each of us stumbling forward in partial blindness, seeing people looking like trees and walking. But the face of Christ is there, hidden in light and shadow, calling us forward into our freedom to love, to see better, to see more clearly. I grew up in a white suburban neighborhood in Lexington, Kentucky, and had very little contact with any peoples of color until my mid-20s, when I moved to Denver and was quickly plunged into more diverse environments. Since then, my religious imagination has been shaped by the movement across various color lines, including immersion in Mexican, American, and Black Catholic parishes in 3 different cities, as well as the study of Black, Latino, and Native American spiritualities, art, and theology. Less than 3 miles from the cathedral parish of my youth in Lexington, there was and still is a thriving Black Catholic church. For almost 3 decades of my life, I'm sad to say, I had very little sense that there was such a thing as Black Catholics. There are some 4 million Catholics of African descent in the United States. I did not know them. Nor was I ever taught the extraordinary history of Black Catholic sisters, priests, and lay parishioners across the country who kept the faith so often in the face of breathtaking racism and discrimination in the church. The veil of my ignorance began to be lifted some 20 years ago when my family joined a Black Catholic community in Denver. In fact, it was a Jesuit parish, St. Ignatian of Loyola. And the relationships we formed there transformed my whole way of being Christian, of being Catholic, and of experiencing the church. How often since then in Black Catholic communities in 3 different cities, I have felt the Spirit rising like a dove and stirring something deep in my heart, as if to say, "Here are my beloved children on whom my favor rests. Can you see them? Do you know them? Will you share their joys and sorrows?" The point I want to emphasize here is that none of us enters the conversation about race a fully developed, completely integrated whole person. Each of us enters the conversation or refuses it from a unique social location and developmental stage in the drama that is a human life. We need to be challenged, but we also need to give each other room to imagine and grow into a future different from what we're accustomed to, from the way things are and where we have been over the course of our lives. The term for this is cura personalis, care for the person, that you meet people where they are and you give them room to grow. Conversations about race are not easy. They call for a great deal more intimacy and risk than many of us are accustomed to sharing with strangers, not to mention family members or even fellow church members. Where will we find the kinds of space needed to navigate such conversations? For those of us privileged to be in a more formal academic setting, the university, the Jesuit Catholic University, I think, is uniquely positioned in particular to provide the kinds of open spaces where a truthful conversation can happen, where roots can be fertilized and new shoots of interracial encounter and friendship are given room to grow. I taught a course here at Xavier last semester called The Black Catholic Experience. And over the course of a semester, just to open up this conversation about our racial history, both in society and in the Catholic Church, it was an incredible experience, and my students taught me a great deal about where they're coming from and the assumptions they have about being black, about being Catholic, about being Christian. It was an amazing experience. But perhaps even more than the academy, the churches, I think, the churches, the synagogues, and the mosques, I believe, are where hope for healing and social transformation across racial lines will take root, or will not. This is where people live and work and pray down at street level. One of my hopes in writing the book, Hope Sings So Beautiful, was to provide a resource and starting point for such conversations. The book builds its mosaic of images and sketches partly from the intuition that racism, among many other things, is the symptom of a profound poverty of imagination, a kind of captivity of imagination, inclusive of our theological imagination, how we imagine and put into practice our most elemental images of God. Moreover, a disease of the imagination calls not only for moral, ethical, and political responses, but also responses that nourish, enlarge, and free the imagination. To say it in Ignatian terms, we have eyes to see, but we do not see. We have ears to hear, but we do not hear. Where others would like to close the book on racial justice and reconciliation, the artists and poets, the mystics and prophets open the book again, showing us that there are still many more beautiful pages to be written. A few of the many spirits who haunted my writing in this book: Billie Holiday, Georgia O'Keeffe, Howard Thurman, Jonathan Kozol, Sister Thea Bowman, James Baldwin, Sean Copeland, Brian Massengale, Eddie Hilson, Malcolm X, the novelist Sue Monk Kidd, the Indians of Taos Pueblo, the spirits of the ancestors whose voice comes to us in the spirituals and slave songs and laments. All of these speak to something more than our heads, more than ideas about race. They speak to our whole person and potentially open the heart. In an interview following the verdict in the George Zimmerman trial, in the killing of Trayvon Martin, Deacon Royce Winters, who is the director here in Cincinnati of African American Ministries for the Archdiocese of Cincinnati, said he thinks that the country has made great progress in combating racism since the late 1960s, but that the subject has faded from a position of importance in the country and in the church. And I quote, "We in America seem to be pursuing our individual goals in life, but we've lost our sense of community, our sense of being connected to something greater than ourselves," Deacon Winters said. "We have failed to consider our obligation to bring others along with us." Bishop Curtis Guillory of Texas, one of about a dozen black Catholic bishops in the United States, echoes Deacon Williams when he said after the trial that the topic is too easily avoided, and I quote, "I don't think race and ethnicity have been the subject of serious dialogue." And then he offered an image that I think is very helpful. It's like you have a two-story house where the floor upstairs is weak in some spots and unstable. So you walk very lightly around those spots. You tread very lightly, or you don't cross them at all. This, he says, is where the church can make a tremendous contribution, but you have to work at it. It's not just going to happen. Our own Rabbi Abi Ingber here at Xavier University, during our celebration of the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington and King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech, Rabbi Abi said this: "Surely the time has come to stop dreaming and to move our feet and our bodies and our hearts into action." It seems to me that people of faith on every side of the racial divide, blacks, whites, Hispanics, Asians, Native Americans, all of us bear responsibility to the degree we have resigned ourselves to the idea that separate but equal is good enough. And therefore, by and large in this country, 11 o'clock Sunday morning remains what Dr. King called the most segregated hour in America.